British Columbia is discussing the future of its power grid, its electrical system, and one of the options that's been put on the table by the BC government is buying cheap renewable energy from the United States, primarily solar from California, but maybe wind from other states. And to talk about that with us today, we've got Ben Kujala, who is the Director of Power Planning for an organization that spans Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho. So welcome to the interview, Ben.
Thank you.
Well, can you give us a bit of an overview of how the market works, the Western electricity market, and is there a lot of surplus renewable energy available that BC could import?
Sure, I'll do my best. From my perspective, you've got a lot of kind of intersecting markets going on right now. So obviously there's a full ISO in California, and California is a big part of the Western grid. So a huge part of our market, and there's also an ISO in Alberta, I wouldn't want to leave that one out. A huge part of the load, adding those together, is covered by more traditional energy markets, where you have a computer that's helping people figure out what's the best way to dispatch power, what's the best plant to turn on, which ones should be turned on in which locations to make sure that energy flows and meets the load, but also to make sure that you're using fuel efficiently, that you're using more efficient plants, you're turning off less efficient plants, and just running the grid in the smartest way possible. So those markets tend to kind of have computers sorting out the dispatch. They also tend to also import and export power. California relies a lot on power that's imported from different regions. So you kind of have to have an interface with the places where those markets don't exist. And so in the Northwest, in the desert Southwest, the markets are more bilateral, which means that maybe there's some sort of technology underlying it, but fundamentally it's not that different than a guy at one utility getting on a phone, calling a guy at another utility and asking for 25 megawatts of power for the next month, and kind of repeat the process over and over again, and everybody kind of sorts it out. There's some infrastructure behind it to make sure that power flows to the right places, but ultimately it's a lot of one-off deals between two parties.
Gotcha. And so we understand that the states in play are building out their renewable capacity. I mean, California is well known for its solar capacity, and that's only going to expand. Does that mean then that there is going to be surplus power available to BC, or are the states also looking at electrifying their economies, like electric vehicles, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of that depends on how the future plays out. And that's a really sort of hard thing for me to forecast. We only have so clear of a crystal ball. But what I would say is, right now, there are certainly times where there's a lot of surplus power in the markets. In short term, there's utilities that have built renewable resources to meet legislation, whether it's clean legislation or RPS legislation, renewable portfolio standards. They've got to build a certain amount of their power, or have a certain amount of the power coming from renewable energy. And to accomplish that, they tend to need to overbuild so that they can make sure that they've got the right amount of energy coming into the portfolio to meet the requirements of the law. And so there are times, certainly, where there's extra power out in the short-term market. That doesn't mean that that's a place that you want to put a lot of reliance on if you want to make sure that you always have reliable and delivered power right to your doorstep. So I think you want to make a distinction between having a long-term available market where you can contract for power and deciding that you're going to leave your position open and take power in the short-term market. And there might be a lot of surplus at times in the short-term market. There also are times where there's not. And so you have to make sure you balance your system against what you expect that future to look like.
And I gather, and especially the California wildfires have put this in, really brought this to the fore, and that is the role of new technologies, but particularly battery storage. California is adding a lot of it, and that would then tend to allow the states to capture that cheap surplus renewable and use it themselves.
Yeah, to some extent. Although again, when you look at the cost of solar and wind compared to the cost of batteries, I think it doesn't make sense to build batteries to capture every surplus ounce of power that those technologies are producing. you really are building batteries to store surplus power so that you can move just enough power into the times where you really need it. So if you were looking at why are they buying batteries? They're not buying it because there's extra power out there and they just want to find a way to use it. They're buying it because they want to make sure they have enough power during their peak need. And so they're sizing the batteries to hold the power basically over to meet that peak. And that means that in a lot of cases, when you look at kind of the direction people are going, there's still going to be plenty of times where there's surplus power in the market, especially for people who are able to go out there and buy and store it. So one strategy for sure would be to have the capability to store. Obviously in the Northwest, we have a fairly large hydro system. BC also has a hydro system. One of the ways that people use the hydro system is to buy power when it's available and cheap on the market and save water, and then route water downriver, within the capabilities that they have during the times when they need the power much more. And that's just a form of storage. Batteries are another form of storage. And so I think what you are looking at is, what are you building the storage for? And then does the pace of development of renewables keep up to build enough surplus power so that you would have the power sitting there that you need to be able to store? And there certainly are a lot of complications with that. You have a much more complicated system now when you add in new generating technologies like wind and solar and storage than we used to have with a more traditional thermal system. But it also creates a lot of opportunities for people who are going to be adaptable and really look at these technologies and try to understand how they complement their systems and how to integrate them into their systems.
How does transmission capacity fit into these markets, and with a particular focus on BC's ability to import renewable energy from the States?
So I can't say I'm an expert on the transmission capacity between BC and the Northwest. I know that it's there. It's been used quite a bit back and forth. I don't think that BC's traditionally been just an exporter or just an importer. I think there's some dynamic interaction on the line already. And I think that that's been something that happens based on the fact that BC has the hydro system, and as I said, the Northwest does too. So there's already back and forth exchange that happens based on the times when that makes sense, when there's an opportunity to store and to generate power. So on a transmission system, once you've built a line, to me, the key is that you always want to use that capacity to the best of your ability. Once you've invested the $1 billion+ it takes to run a transmission line, really the best thing you can do is make sure that you can utilize it. And so I think as much as there are times where those transmission lines are constrained, there's also times where they're not. And the ability to bring power in or out of BC or anywhere else and store it is a good thing to do and a good thing to look at when you're considering the resources available.
Final question, Ben, and that is, what's your take on the risk associated with climate change, particularly wildfires, but maybe there's other risk as well, and the risk to generation capacity in the Northwest and California, and also transmission capacity?
So we have started out, we're in the midst of doing we do a power plan every 5 years, where we try to look at our region and say, what is the sort of risks that we're facing going forward? We look forward 20 years, every 5 years, so kind of on a cycle. And this time we really set out saying we were going to fundamentally put climate change into everything that we had any way to quantify. So we really approached climate change as, this is the way that we want to plan for the future risk. It's best to capture that risk to the extent of our capability and make sure that whatever plans we're putting in are adapting to that risk. And I think you've seen some things that people may or may not associate with climate change, but certainly have had a impact on how we plan. So increasingly, we're seeing obviously warmer temperatures, but also the impact of that is more adoption of things like air conditioning and more summer load in our region. So it's not simply that there's a temperature change, it's also the behavior that's associated with it. And some of that might just be technology and societal as well. But really, when we project out climate change, we look at what's the impact on, especially the runoff, the water that comes down the hydro system. What's the impact on the temperatures in our region? We want to make sure that we fundamentally plan for all of those potential impacts and get it into the system as best as possible. Of course, there are things that are just far beyond any ability of a planner. You know, in the wildfires in California, one of the things that did happen was, of course, there was a lot of cover from smoke, which impacted the ability of the solar generation to provide power for the grid. And that might be the sort of thing that will happen more regularly in the future, but it's something that's complicated or difficult to plan for, of course. You don't know when or where future wildfires will happen. So the other things like if there's inundation on the coastlines or load destruction from natural sort of disaster events, it's really hard to project things like that. And so there's a lot about climate change that are risks that we don't have a lot of ways to estimate or quantify. And there's a lot about climate change that we're doing our best to get our arms around and understand and try and balance it out. And I think it's good to get where you can, you know, as rigorously and honestly as you can in putting the data first. And it's also good to acknowledge that there's limitations to that. And there's a certain amount of climate change that risk that may or may not be easy to plan for.
And thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your insights. And we'll look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Thank you for having me. It's a great conversation.